Hello and welcome to the last substantive webinar in our two-day policy summit of social justice convening. This particular webinar is titled Pro Tip Anti-Racist Allyship, and we are delighted to have a really accomplished circle of experts join us to share their best practices and experiences on this important subject, particularly given the specific racial, social, and political moment that we find ourselves in. So I want to alert you to the participant handbook. Each of you should have received a copy several days ago. Essentially, the program book includes not only a copy of the program agenda, but also all of the biographies of our panelists. They are quite accomplished. And so rather than eat up the very limited time that we have allotted for this particular discussion, we want to direct your attention to that handbook where their accomplishments are set out in full. And we hope you'll take the time to review them. So let me begin by turning to you, Jasmine. I had the pleasure of viewing your TED Talk about why you're tired of talking about race, and I found it really moving. I'm not sure if that's where you want to start, but definitely interested in hearing your thoughts at this particular juncture.
Yeah, absolutely. I can just start off introducing myself and then how I'm approaching anti-racist allyship. So again, I'm Jasmine Roberts. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm a strategic communication professor in the School of Communication at Ohio State. And there I'm looking at a lot of different things, open educational policies and practices, public communication campaigns, digital activism, which we're seeing a lot of in light of what's going on, in our society. So when I think of the issue of anti-racist allyship, I'm really coming from a Black intersectional feminist standpoint. But I also acknowledge that I'm coming from a very Western standpoint and that there is a larger global movement to engage in social justice. But, of course, this looks different depending upon where we're at in the world. And so I also think it's time to be specific in our words when we're talking about racialized realities. So for the next, 15 minutes or so that I have, I am purposely centering Blackness and talking about Black experiences for two reasons. There is a frequent misuse of the term people of color when people really just want to say Black people, although of course there are situations in which we say people of color, we actually mean people of color. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because, using the term people of color when you really mean Black people erases the unique experiences that Black people go through, as well as the unique experiences that other minoritized communities go through. And the second reason why I'm specifically talking about Black people is because this racial reckoning that the United States is going through and was confronted with painfully, particularly over the summer, is about Black lives and has been for centuries. And there have been, very intentional, very measured systemic racist processes that contribute to the devaluation of Black humanity. And so, various organizations set an interest in being more intentional about, for example, diversity and inclusion. This year, has a great deal to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and protests over the summer. So I think it's only reasonable and logical to talk about Blackness and center it. And I'll also be using terms like white supremacy and whiteness and systemic racism. Yet I also want to acknowledge that I think it's understandable that we can get overwhelmed when we're using these terms. Like we're born into the system and the culture that privileges, whiteness and what have you. So to think about reimagining these structures and ways of knowing can be very intimidating and daunting, right? But this work is worth doing and doing carefully, intentionally, and of course, thoughtfully. And the alternative of not doing the work, for me at least, is just not acceptable. And so part of, disrupting the structure is challenging some of the norms that come with it. And one of the norms that I hope that we consider is this avoidance. And when we talk about mental health, that I know that doesn't really seem related to the topic at hand, but I think it is. Especially now because there's just so much isolation and anxiety and depression going on, of course, now than perhaps previously. It shouldn't take, for example, a pandemic to, acknowledge systemic racism and the modern legacies of systemic racism to see our colleagues and other people as human. And so for me as a professor, this is expressed, teaching with empathy. That's a fundamental part of my teaching philosophy. So for example, when we found out that, Breonna Taylor in her case was not going to receive justice, I couldn't help but to think about some of my Black students in the classroom and how they were feeling. Can you imagine the trauma, right? The feeling of systemic disempowerment that, Black people across the world are experiencing, that they're being killed at the very hands of those who are supposed to protect and serve them. And there's almost always very little justice, excuse me. And so, this emotional baggage is really unbearable. And I have to let you in on a little secret. Many of your Black colleagues and friends are afraid to share this racial battle fatigue that they, experience, because they're afraid their feelings will be dismissed or be, belittled to something else, or they're afraid that people will engage in what we call the oppression Olympics, right? Well, my great-great-great-grandfather was also a slave in Ireland or something like that. Well, right now we're talking about Black people. And so we sit in our meetings, in our classrooms and everything, trying to suppress or not acknowledge this racial trauma that we're going through. So with that being said, for me, this human approach, centered on wellness and healing is a direct act of resistance against a world and society that I feel like is determined to dehumanize me as a Black woman. And this dehumanization is nothing new, as there's a very shameful history of the dehumanization of people of color in general in the West in order to justify oppressive measures and systems. And then also, as a friendly reminder, it is an act of oppression when you ask the oppressed to educate you about how they deal with oppression, and then you do nothing about it. Oppressed people should not be charged to educate those who benefit from oppression, or at least those who, again, benefit from oppressive systems, I should say. This expectation is not put on those who benefit from oppressive systems, like, for example, cisgender men or those from the global north, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that being said, I feel like if you ask someone to share their experiences of racial trauma, for example, and you do nothing about it, you're not handling their story with care at all. And care for me is not just a feeling, it's an action. And so getting to the point of what to do, what do we do about these things? I'm going to elaborate, on this in a few, but, if you don't take anything else away from what I'm talking about just now, I feel like anti-racist allyship really requires three things. That's, first one is transparency. Admit that you need to improve in anti-racist allyship, and that can mean and take on a variety of, different actions. So for example, on an organizational level, publish your D&I, your diversity inclusion figures. Admit that, perhaps that you weren't doing as well in terms of within that area, and commit to actually improving, actually follow through with that corrective action plan. Over the summer, for example, we saw a lot of organizations who were engaging in, empathy statements and what have you, with very little corrective action plans. So being transparent is very, very key. And then along those lines, empathy goes a long way. So acknowledge and respect the racialized trauma of Black people and other people of color. You can't just, for example, reduce racism to interpersonal racism, the ones that we can, or the type that we can see so easily and is so tangible. Avoid doing what we call performative allyship, really listen with empathy and humility, and try not to project your racialized realities onto others. So just because it's not within your experience doesn't mean that it invalidates or that it's not happening to someone else. And the last thing is being consistent. I think there's this knee-jerk reaction to want to engage in this instant gratification in allyship, right? And it really is a lifetime commitment. This work is hard, y'all. It is very, very hard. It's messy. Sometimes it's challenging, but it is, again, worth doing. We can't just reduce it to, a social media square or black dot or what have you. So what we really have to do when we're talking about anti-racist allyship is question, for example, policies and procedures that are within our organization and how they exacerbate structural inequities. We have to do this because it's not enough to tout diversity inclusion and then have the same policies, procedures, and traditions that harm Black people and other people of color. We get caught up in these terms like systemic racism and institutional bias and discrimination. And for me, I feel like we even hide behind those terms. We posit it as it's vague, when in reality, at the end of the day, it's people, right? It's people who are upholding these traditions, policies, and procedures. So we really have to get down to what do we mean by diversity inclusion, and not just doing it from a performative core standpoint. And so if your institution, for example, is really struggling to attract Black people and other people of color, you have to look at your policies. Do you actually value Black people and other people of color? Are you just attracting Black people and other people of color for D&I measurements? Are you trying to create an environment in which they can truly, thrive? And I feel like, in order to do that, you have to center a social justice framework at the core of what you do. That means the critique of privileged politics to be at the core of your advocacy work. This means having uncomfortable conversations, right? And participating in these uncomfortable conversations. For those who are privileged identities, like socially privileged identities, like, for example, white people on an interpersonal level, it means giving up social capital. When you call out white supremacy or whiteness, you're going to offend certain people, right? And so it means going beyond white guilt and white tears, because this can lead to what I believe is like white saviorism, which is something that's very counterproductive to anti-racist allyship and anti-racist work in general. So, and it ultimately doesn't, help people of color. So just to kind of wrap up, I feel like, this commitment to addressing systemic racism is even more important now during, this time than ever. We really can't waver or buy into the idea that this work has to wait, because it's so vital today. This is the perfect time for the very reasons that I've stated for the past, 15 minutes, because of the pandemic, Black people in particular are in very precarious situations as they negotiate their Blackness within white spaces. And there really are no, I know, a lot of anti-racist advocates talk about this, but there really are no sides to racism. It's wrong, right? And this includes institutional racism, not just superficial interpersonal racism. There are no sides when it comes to the issue of Black livelihood and Black life. There is no opinion on this. Black people, life indeed is our birthright. And so despite so many institutions remaining okay with systemic racism, I want to remind you that we can't negotiate our livelihood contrary to what we've been told and taught. So yeah, just kind of wrap things up, really think about the ways in which whiteness and white supremacy as a system permits this, and how we can practically address this. We really have to remain steadfast in our social justice work, because there's so much going on in this world and so much healing to do.
Wonderful. That was particularly powerful, Jasmine. I want to follow up on some of the points that you made. I appreciate the emphasis on language and how the failure to use specific reference to Blackness and Black identity results in erasure of specific experiences. And I think that's a really important point to make, because I think that oftentimes when we use phrases like people of color, that realization is not there, right? And so I think understanding the impact of specific words and phrases is important. You also highlight the role of mental health, and I feel like that's such a timely issue to highlight, because the research in the context of the current public health crisis reflects that about 50% of Americans are actually grappling with mental health issues. And that doesn't necessarily speak directly to issues that may relate to intersectional aspects of one's identity.
Right.
It's really being shared in the context of the public health crisis. And so we know that depending on the cultural context, there's still a lot of stigma surrounding mental health, even when we know that half of our compatriots are sort of grappling with the same or similar challenges that we are. And so I guess one of the immediate follow-up questions I have for you is, how do we chip away at that cultural stigma, realizing that it's very context specific and not necessarily as stigmatic for certain groups as it is for others. But if you have insights, since you did highlight the significance of addressing mental health issues, how do we do so in a way that's culturally sensitive and realizing the stigma surrounding that issue?
Yeah.
Also, I found it particularly powerful, this idea of don't request the oppressed to talk about their oppression without doing something about it, because that too is oppressive, right? And so many of your recommendations translate well in an institutional context. I'm wondering if you have any specific instructions or suggestions for an individual. What can be done? I know that, reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Kendi, one of the things that I found powerful about his book is sort of this personal reflection of internalized bias towards his own community. And I think his own, sharing that recognition then sort of gives you as the reader permission to recognize your own shortcomings, right? And so I'm wondering, really important recommendations, best practices for institutions, but what about individuals who may be listening and watching and have good intentions, but not sure where to go from here? And then lastly, with respect to the best practice of questioning policies and procedures, it strikes me when I hear that, I can't help but think that within certain institutional contexts, there are individuals or groups that have more privilege to do so without necessarily being concerned about retaliatory measures or adverse actions that may be taken because you're questioning the status quo and rocking the boat. And so in your view, do you believe that there are certain groups with that sort of privilege that have an enhanced obligation to be scrutinizing and challenging those policies and practices? And how do you do that in a way, again, that's sensitive to diversity and inclusion, because you still need those diverse viewpoints, right, to actually get better policies in an institutional context? So I know that's a lot, but whatever you can share.
Yeah. Absolutely. Those are great questions. And I do want to acknowledge a couple of things. So like I said, this work is very messy and very challenging in the sense of we're talking about kind of trying to dismantle a system that we were born into, especially here in the Western context. I talked about this a little bit in the TED Talk that you referred to in another article that I published on Medium called White Academia Do Better. And I sometimes feel like there are things in the long term that are very difficult to do when we're talking about anti-racist allyship. But there are very tangible, practical things that we can do. And one of them is actually working with the same framework when we're talking about, for example, racism. I have been in the camp, or I've had lived experiences where we're kind of not even talking about the same thing when we're referring to racism or anti-racism, right? And so just acknowledging that, racism is not just the interpersonal racism that we're so used to, operationalizing or being able to identify, that it is truly a system that we are born into that privileges certain groups and disadvantages other groups, if we want to use that term there. And so with that being said, I think it means like working with the same definitions and the same framework. I think it also means, again, listening with empathy and humility and not really projecting your racialized realities onto other people. Now, that last point, can you rephrase that question a little bit in terms of like, those issues that you were addressing in that last question? Because I want to make sure that I get on that as well.
So I think you made a recommendation about, questioning policies and procedures within an institutional context, that, may not necessarily reflect equity or culminate in equality. And it just occurs to me that depending on that institutional context, certain individuals have more privilege than others. To do so, right? And so there may be a real fear. I feel like there is this kind of this reality of silence, not because people don't care, not because they don't necessarily want to see transformational change occur in any particular context, but because they're fearful of the potential consequences of being part of that change. And so I'm just wondering, you know, in a practical sense, how you approach that.
Yeah, I think
are working with are not necessarily well changed. They feel like the status quo benefits them, right?
I'm sorry, I think I lost you on the last point. I don't know if anyone else heard that. Breaking up a little bit. No?
Angie, we lost you in your
That's okay.
question, about half of your question.
It's okay. It's okay. Well, let me go on. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. So it's okay. I'll go on to the next speaker. Yeah, we'll come back to it. So Wajahat, we're happy that you're able to join us. I hope Sarah and the kids are doing well. You know, you have an established record of allyship with both, you know, sometimes some criticism, right? In terms of some of the stances that you've taken. And so while I think it's good-hearted, I'm wondering if you can speak to your own experiences and best practices and advice that you may have for others. Because I think that oftentimes when we think about being an ally to an individual or to an institution or even to a community, we assume that allyship will translate into positive results. But I think in your case, it's been sort of a mixed bag.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. It seems like I'm coming from an insane asylum, but I promise you that's not the case. This is the only room where I can hide from my 3 wildlings who will probably burst through the door right there at any time. So don't judge me too harshly. And I hope everyone is at home and safe. And thank you for inviting me on this panel. Just basically do whatever Jasmine tells you to do, number 1. And number 2, just moving forward, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'll answer Angie's question and give you some anti-racist ally tips and talk about the fraught terrain that we're in. I was born and raised in Fremont, California to 2 Pakistani Muslim immigrants. And my parents thought it'd be hilarious not to teach me, their only child, English, because who needs English in the United States of America? So they only taught me 3 phrases of English when I went to Child's Hideaway Preschool. And the 3 phrases of English were shut up, because my mother used to say shut up, idiot, because my mother used to say shut up, idiot, and oh Pasgedio. If you're a child of the 80s like I am, there used to be a commercial, the oh Spaghetti commercial, but I was a fobby kid, so that's all I knew. I was also the token Muslim, the token brown guy. I found out that other people don't have lentil stains on their shirt. Everyone else spoke. I went to ESL, English as a Second Language. They put me in ESL as a first grader in the United States of America, even though I was born and raised here because I couldn't speak English. I was also very healthy. And healthy is a nice way of saying big boned. And big boned is a nice way of, in Arabic, they say mashallah. And I was also very fat. So I was fat, shy, brown, Muslim, couldn't speak English. I was a winner. But somehow I ended up graduating with an English major from UC Berkeley. Ended up marrying a brilliant doctor and high school varsity cheerleader, #ItGetsBetter. And I am a recovering attorney. But oftentimes being the token Muslim, the token South Asian, I was the cultural ambassador, I realized, of 1.7 billion people and 1,400 years of Islamic civilization. I was asked in elementary school, high school, college, always to represent this thing called Islam and Muslims. And at first it was fine, right? Growing up, the worst thing I was called was Gandhi, which was actually a compliment, but they used to use it as a diss. But things changed after 2001, the 9/11 terror attacks. And ever since then, we became the enemy. It was, tag you're it. And that American story where one group gets chosen to be the antagonist, well, that remake now included us, Muslims, Islam. And it's really funny because even though I was born and raised in this country, in America, I was always asked, and I'm still asked, why does why does Islam hate us? And when I go to Muslim majority countries, I get asked, why does the West hate Islam? And the whole time I'm asking myself, who is Islam and who is the West, and how come I've never met either of them? And it's very interesting to always have your loyalty questioned, to have your patriotism questioned, to always be seen as a suspect. And what we also found out on 9/11, for many of us like me who were children of immigrants whose parents came here after the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, we found out that we weren't white. We knew we weren't white, but we chased whiteness because everyone knows they have a choice in America if you're a person of color. You can either chase whiteness and get close to whiteness and be absorbed by whiteness and protected by whiteness, and you want to run away as far as you can from blackness, because we see in America that blackness is associated with inequality, injustice, racism, but the whites are the protagonists of the American narrative. The whites are the presidents. The whites are mainstream. And a lot of South Asians and Arab Americans, if we're to be honest, after the baptism of fire that was 9/11, discovered, oh my God, we are not included in whiteness. We are not part of the mainstream. We're not the protagonists. They see us as the villain. And I was a college student when 9/11 happened. I was a 20-year-old undeclared senior at UC Berkeley. And I was a student leader of the Muslim Student Association. And that was, if you will, my baptism of fire, right? That became my X-Men Danger Room simulation, where basically overnight we had to become not only representatives of this thing called Islam, but we had to be perfect. On the drop of the dime, I had to be a walking Wikipedia expert on Islam, Muslims, the Quran, Sharia, Hakim Olajuwon, Salman Khan, Bollywood, like Afghanistan, Iran, everything. And I had to be perfect. And if there was ever one mistake, not only would I be indicted, but all these other people who were Muslim or looked Muslim to me would also be indicted, convicted, and sentenced by a nameless judge, jury, and executioner that holds their loyalty as suspect. We fast forward to 2016, and there's a president, Donald Trump, who literally runs on the Muslim ban, and he descends the golden staircase, which wasn't a golden staircase, and says that Mexicans are rapists and criminals, and he wants a wall. And this man won the election. And fast forward to 2020, even though Joe Biden won by 7 million votes, and yes, he won the election, we still see that 73 million people said, you know what? This guy, this Donald Trump, he's going to make America great again. And if you guys are following Twitter right now, they've released the 4 finalists of the Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Dr. Fauci, a lifelong expert on infectious diseases who's trying to save lives during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Joe Biden, who won a historic election. Something called the Racial Justice Movement, which I think is George Floyd. They didn't even name him, but his name is George Floyd, who was choked to death. And his death then spurred the largest organic protest in U.S. history, where anywhere from 15 to 22 million people came out during a pandemic to protest racism and white supremacy and to actually embrace Black Lives Matter, and also Donald Trump. So what we're witnessing right now in 2020 America is something that, even though I was born and raised in this country as a Muslim, as a person of color, as a guy who was in ESL, as a guy who was picked on, I had never experienced this type of visceral anti-Muslim sentiment that I am experiencing now. I write for the New York Times, I go on CNN, and the type of emails that I get, the hatred in them, the viciousness is something stunning, even to me, where I get told to this day, go back to where you came from. And I go, Fremont, California, the Bay Area, I would love to. Can you please pay the rent? But this is the reality that we live in. And for many of us, I think for Muslims, for Black people, for Latinos, for people of color, resistance to Donald Trump was not just protesting policies or voting. Resistance meant literally walking outside of the door of your house with your head held up high. Resistance meant holding on to dignity. Resistance meant telling your children, hey, you too belong. Resistance meant putting a smile on your face. Resistance meant literally surviving. And so what we're talking about is not just, oh, these Black and brown people always whining and complaining, always playing the race card, you race hustlers, always looking for, a special handout. No, we're talking about survival. We're talking about dignity. We're talking about equality. And so in order to be an anti-racist ally, first and foremost, you have to be anti-racist. That means you have to be proactively against this thing called racism and white supremacy, which is not just a system of policies, but also as a paradigm, an ideology, a structure that has elevated whiteness above all else and demean the rest of us. And if you don't believe me, they say that the number one indicator for many Trump voters and supporters was not economic anxiety, It was racial anxiety, specifically the fear that they were being replaced. Now, I'll give you a quick analogy for the rest of us, how it looks like for the rest of us. But 91% of representation of power, gatekeepers, the New York Times did a study in the summer, those who are in power, in law, in media, in government, it's white faces. So when me and Jasmine and Zeenat get into a room, we're like, oh my God, we're the one person of color in this room. These 10 seats that were occupied by white folks, now we're one. But to some others, if you've been in power your whole life, as you've heard this before, equality looks like oppression. What they see is there used to be 10 of us, and now there's only 9. There used to be 10 of us, and now look at Zeenat and Jasmine Wajahat. They took away 3. We are being replaced. And that anxiety has to be confronted and named. And another thing that has to be confronted and named is racism. In America, I have seen that you can literally discuss anything and everything except racism. Even the people who are part of the KKK don't like being called racist. No one likes being called racist in America. You could call someone an a-hole, you can make fun of their mother, but if you call them racist, they will cry. We do not acknowledge racism. It's like Voldemort in this country, right? Because if we acknowledge racism and if we acknowledge that white supremacy exists, then we have to confront it. And not only do we have to confront it and dismantle it, we have to ask, what is our role in upholding it? And so with this, if you don't mind, with the last 5 minutes, what I will say is give some tips and answer also Angie's question. We are dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with racial injustice. We're dealing with hurricanes. We're dealing with income inequality. And many people say, Wajahat, I'm just one person. I don't write for the New York Times like you. I don't get on TV. I'm not a lawyer. What can I do? And this is my very basic common sense, some tips. I hope you can take them to heart. 3 things we can do. First and foremost, I would recommend everyone who's listening to have awareness. You actually have to work towards awareness. You have to work towards it. I want to be aware about what's happening in the world and in my community. There's this thing called racism. Black people are complaining about police brutality. Muslims are complaining about Islamophobia. There's anti-immigrant sentiment. There's misogyny. What's happening? Let me learn some more. So have awareness, number 1. Awareness is not enough. Number 2, you need to make an intention. The intention is to create a small positive footprint in your local community that can resonate and create a powerful ripple effect, right? Make the intention. There's something really powerful about getting an idea out from your head and literally verbalizing it or writing it. And the third thing I would say is action. Commit yourself to an action. And if you think this is silly, I will say this. 15 to 22 million people came out during a pandemic to protest George Floyd's death. The Women's March before George Floyd protest was the biggest march in US history. People spontaneously came out during the second week of Trump's presidency when he did the Muslim ban. Literally, people came out organically to protest the Muslim ban at airports. There are people who use their social media profiles just to say Black Lives Matter, just to support DACA kids. It goes a long way. Interfaith, right? And in the last couple of minutes, I could tell you my interesting work in interfaith. You could do a lot by literally picking up the phone and reaching out to your local synagogue or your local church or your local mosque saying, hey, our communities haven't talked, but can I come and address your community? Can we have some shared ground? Can we have some shared values for social justice? Schools, oftentimes I was the token representative and educator of all things Islam because my teachers had no other textbooks, no other books, no other resources. You could be that adult who says, hey, in my local school, I can come and talk about how it feels to be a Muslim or a Jew. I could tell you about Ramadan or synagogues. Politics, run for office. If this country can elect Donald Trump, run for office. Everything begins at the local level. Run for office, run for city council, join the school board. And finally, the media. I'm a person in the media. Everyone complains about the media. Build relationships with local journalists or your local TV stations. Literally, that means you can email them, call them up, pitch them stories, or say, hey, I can be your expert. I can tell you some stories, because oftentimes, Angie will tell you, I can tell you, they just don't know. As far as if you're in an environment, a work environment, what you can do, recruit, mentor, and train a diverse staff. Have the company look like America and your clients. Look around your boardroom right now, and if it does not look like America and if it's homogenous, that's a problem. Someone in that gatekeeper status of those 10 board members can and should step in and say, there's 8 dudes here. We need some more women. There's 9 white guys. Maybe we need to do some work on our end to get some people of color. Second thing I would say is invest in resources in true diversity training and inclusion and outreach. What Jasmine said, not tokenism. You just don't put a person of color on the brochure, right? And say, hey, look, one person of color. You actually have meaningful elevation of people of color and women in roles of prominence, right? And then finally, I would say, if it's possible, offer scholarships or internships or jobs to certain marginalized communities to give them experiences. Oftentimes, people don't look like us as gatekeepers, so we never get mentors. And if you can do this, and these are just some small practical things, I think you can help create your workspace and make it like the America that looks like me, that has always looked like us, but oftentimes we have been excised, marginalized, or ignored. And finally, as Jasmine said, and I will reiterate this is tough work. Toes will be stepped on. These are uncomfortable conversations. You will feel defensive. People will have their feelings hurt. And despite all of this, I still recommend that you stick with it. You stick with it, you stick with it. All of us will make mistakes, but if your intention is in the right place, you can learn. We want to make this a just and equitable society. No one's looking for special status. Everyone is just looking for equal status. And if you think this is all nonsense, I will say this. I have 3 children. You might not have kids, or you might one day have kids. You might not care about this, but suppose you have kids or grandkids or loved ones. Fast forward 20, 30 years. Do you want them to live in the United States of America where they have an equal opportunity to achieve their dreams, or based on their gender or their race or their religion, they will be mocked, ridiculed, and marginalized? Is that what you want for your loved ones? And if you don't want that for your loved ones, then we have to put in the work right now, because what we're witnessing right now in America, in my opinion, is the death rattle of white supremacy that has transformed into a death march. And the only way to combat it is not through kumbaya and, like nice little emojis. It's through active anti-racist work. And all of us can do our small part, and at the very least make ourselves better, our family better, and our community better. And I used up my 15 minutes, but in the Q&A, NG, if you want, I can answer that direct question you had.
Actually, thanks, Wajahat. That was really powerful. And, I really appreciate all the concrete recommendations. Regarding the very first one that you had about individuals trying to raise their own awareness, what is sort of a practical way for someone to do this effectively?
So Jasmine mentioned something, and I saw in the Q&A, I've been trying to follow the chats, guys, that someone said, when Jasmine said, don't expect Black people and people of color to do all the labor and all the work. You have to do some work also. Then someone in the chat, and pardon me, I think it was, I can't scroll. Alex, he said, I'm somewhat puzzled, right, and disappointed because, if I have good intentions and I want to reach out, how come you're not supposed to do the work? What we mean by it is this. Look, we're always doing the work, right? People of color and women are always doing the work. And I guarantee you it's exhausting. I would love to play Cyberpunk 2077 that just came on Amazon right now instead of doing this, even though I love doing this. All right. I would love to write like a short story. I would love to go play with my kids. This is exhausting, draining work. What we mean is this. Every healthy relationship requires reciprocity. Any good marriage requires reciprocity. So if I'm reaching my hand across the aisle all the time and you're slapping it away, or if you're ignoring it, or if you're saying, we're all the moderate Muslims, and I'm like, can't you just Google? Where are all these Black people, and why? How come they're protesting all the time? Can't you just, read a book? Can't you just literally just listen to the people who are, suppose you agree or disagree with defund the police. I'm just giving you an example. Just read about it. Like, why do some people say defund the police? It'll take you 5 minutes, right? And so what we're saying is you have to put in the work and the effort. Meet us halfway. My hand's always going to be stretched across the aisle. I just need partners who are willing to put in some of the investment to make a reciprocal, healthy relationship. And what then you can do is to reach out. Maybe come to your friend and say, listen, I know you're exhausted, but you put in time and effort in this. I'm willing to do the work. Where should I start? What should I do? What should I read? What should I see? Is there a documentary? Is there a book? You tell me. And then if you have time, are you willing to have a conversation with me? And that approach is so much more better than these Muslims. Where's the moderate Muslim? Prove to me that you have the civilizational capacity to be included as a Western American. Prove to me that you deserve equality and rights. Prove to me that Black people aren't rioting. Totally different mindset, totally different intention, totally different outreach. And that makes all the difference. I hope that was helpful for a lot of those folks. And I know, again, listen, I know people mean well, right? I really do. And this is fraught work. And oftentimes, so many of you, the 280 attendees, are like, man, I'm just so terrified. I want to ask Jasmine a question, but if I ask her the question the wrong way, or if I ask Waj the right way, you guys are gonna like shut me down and call me like a Karen or an Amy. And I'm not a Karen and Amy. And even if I'm Karen, I'm a good Karen. And I don't want to be mocked and ridiculed. That's why I'll just shut up. I understand where you're coming from, but I would still say reach out in an intentional way. And when we could see it, we can see in the effort and the outreach and the intention. And I guarantee you, yeah, you might have one or two people who might be offended, but you'll have about 30 people who say, thank you so much for putting in the work and for being sincere. You'll have that many more allies. Stick with it.
I want to follow up on that point because I think, I put in the chat, like progress over perfection. It's cheesy, but it's true. And then also when we get so caught up in intention, we are once again centering our feelings instead of the work. Right. And so we have to get beyond intention. We have to get beyond trying to not offend people. I mean, someone else had just voiced, avoiding using ableist language, right? When someone calls you out on something that you did, whether it's your intention or not, thank them for using the time and energy to make you a well-informed person. I think we have to move beyond intention because once more, it centers those feelings and centers, I feel like I'm hedging myself now. It centers those who have always been at the center, their feelings, instead of, again, doing the hard anti-racist work.
Great. Thank you so much, Wajahat. Thank you. That was wonderful and very instructional. Zeenat, I want to turn to you. You head up the Inclusive America Project at the Aspen Institute. So you bring a unique perspective to this conversation. What do you have to say?
Hi, everybody. First, I want to say that I'm blown away that there's over 280 people on this call. I think when Wajahat talks about intention, you all have made an intention to be here and to listen to this and to ostensibly participate in difficult conversations. So that is the first step. I know that, and we have a hard stop, Angie, at 2:30 or 3:30 rather. Is that? You're on mute.
We're going to do our best.
Okay. Well, I don't want to cut off Brie, so I'm going to go quickly. So when I was in high school, my dad used to drop me off to school at 6:30 every morning and head to the warehouse that he owned on the southwest side of Chicago. And my dad ran what he euphemistically called a machinery business, but was actually him acting as a middleman, buying and selling large machinery. The warehouse was in a depressed neighborhood that was filled with warehouses, which were also mostly in disrepair. And in the 20 or so years that he did this work, he became part of the community. So he knew the guy who would come around looking for scrap metal. He paid one of the kids in the neighborhood to walk and feed the dogs that protected his property. If someone came looking for work, he would find something for them to do and pay them in cash. And occasionally he'd also let people sleep in the warehouse. And over the course of his time working there, the folks that lived in that neighborhood also looked out for my dad and took care of him and took care of his warehouse. And I didn't know it then, but this idea of trusted relationships that lead people to support one another because they can expect to receive reciprocal support has a name, right? And that's social capital. And they're the informal networks that people rely on and that civil society is built on. And this like very powerful thing to understand about civil society is it's not private sector, it's not government, it is us, right? We are civil society. And so when you think about kind of the meta narrative or the things that the stories that about the South Side of Chicago, about an immigrant, about a Muslim American man, I don't think you conjure up those stories of who my dad was and the relationships that he built in his local community through the work that he did. And so when I think of all of the different kinds of stories we tell ourselves, I think we often get caught in this loop of like polarization and distrust and loneliness and anxiety and all of those things. But the story of progress in this country is that micro story of individuals. It's the work that is happening in local communities across this country, especially in Black and Brown communities, which have been disinvested in, historically disinvested in, right? And so over the last 50 years, what's happened is that civil society has kind of eroded, right? And that infrastructure that we had to meet one another, to know one another, to build relationship has gone away. I mean, and there's different reasons for this, and I'm not going to get into the drivers, the economic and other drivers and reasons that that's happened. But I think if there's one takeaway you have today, it's that wherever we sit, I think we have to all find ways to ruthlessly scale social capital and social cohesion. So finding places and spaces where we can encounter one another on a level playing field and thinking about with intention how we approach those conversations when we have them. And so I think part of what, what I said about the story of progress in this country, and even if you look at the voter turnout, right, that was driven by women of color, especially Black women, that you have to look at the role of civil society leaders. And they're known and trusted in their communities. The work I do focuses on religious pluralism and faith-based actors and their role in civil society. These civil society leaders are motivated by a deep calling to reach out to those who are marginalized. And they understand that we're like all in it together, right? That everybody in the community rises together. I would say the problem is that there's a large gap between these change makers and the people who have resources and connections in our society. I would include us all in that latter category of people who have resources and connection in our societies. So many of these leaders don't have formal organizations. They don't have the time to apply for foundation grants. They don't have the social connections to figure out how to get support and counsel. They don't have access to people who could help them develop their skills and capacity. And so if we all operate from a position of privilege, and again, I would say every single one of us does, I think we have to think about how are we narrowing that gap? The story on the ground, the movement on the ground, and all these types of conversations that we are a part of. And so that's work that we focus on in my work at Aspen. And I can send some stuff through the chat link, so I'm not spending time on it right now. And I want to go straight to kind of my concrete suggestions and pro tips so that Brie has time to talk as well. I tried to really come up with kind of concrete ideas around what you can do, each one of you. And I think like this has been said by Jasmine and Wajahat. Number one, don't wait for the right people or the perfect moment to take action, right? And like it doesn't exist and it's never going to happen. You have to get in the arena, you have to get messy. And number two, find guides. So listen to movement leaders and others who work closely with them and get close to those most directly impacted by the problem. And so I know we just had this conversation about the burden on the minority to explain why they have the right to, exist or be equal. And I totally get that and I accept that. I also think that like sitting and theorizing, as like an armchair expert doesn't actually do anything. And so you actually have to go to the communities that are impacted by the things that, you are sitting there thinking about or reading about. So if it's food insecurity right now, like that is a really big deal in Chicago, and everywhere because of the pandemic, whatever that issue is, speak to the people who are most directly impacted, but do not expect them to come up with all of the solutions. Don't put the burden of progress or of motion on them. And then I think finding a community that you can grapple honestly on what we give up and what we gain in fighting for equality and justice. So this idea that there is going to be a push and pull, that we're not going to all be able to kind of stay in the spaces and places that we are, that that struggle will not be done quickly or alone, but that this is not just good for, African Americans or Muslim Americans or whatever the hyphen is, but the fact that is that like we are all of our fates are tied with one another, whether we like it or not, right? So we're not going to change any of the massive structural issues in this country if we only do that with Democrats or we only do that with Republicans. So we actually have to find a way to work together. And I think that's uncomfortable. It require listening. It's going to require acknowledging privilege. And then the last thing I'll say, which is just kind of a plug for our work, is when you think about your diversity, equity, inclusion work, if you're within an institution, you have to also consider faith identity. It's often like the ignored, right? Like diversity factor, but especially for speaking as a Muslim American, it's something that we feel the disproportionate kind of impact of on us. And so really, as we're thinking about equity, we shouldn't leave this idea of like faith being meaningful and important in people's lives. We shouldn't just leave that like ignored and, something that's for the private, for private conversation. This should be a factor of people's identity. This is a factor of people's identity that is incredibly important to them. It should also be part of this conversation.
Excellent. I really enjoyed reading your article that you wrote somewhat recently for the Aspen Institute regarding religious freedom and how to be an ally to diverse faith communities. And it reminds me that we actually have a recommended reading list and resources that is part of the participant handbook that's been distributed. It's also on the event page and it'll be distributed along with copies of the video transcript at the conclusion of the summit. So if you want to follow up and read a little bit more about our insights from our panelists, I encourage you to look out for that email to check out the resources that we've compiled for you. Lastly, Brie, this is your area of expertise, and I also enjoyed reading your article. I think you wrote it about a year or so ago about how to be a fearless ally. And so really looking forward to your insights as well.
Thanks. So I want to start by acknowledging something that Wajahat said, which is that no one's ever asked me or told me to go back to where I came from. But I actually wasn't born in the United States. And that's what it actually means to walk around with some privilege, right? So if you put Waj and I next to each other and said which one was born in the southern Philippines under a dictator and which one was born in Fremont, California, you'd mix up the answers. And that's a small component of what we're talking about. But I want to actually go back to when I was 4 years old. And my dad said, he came home, he was doing his internship for medicine. And he came home and he said, someone is coming over from my department. And I said, oh, when he comes, can I answer the door? And he said, yes. And when he comes in, you answer the door and you say, good evening, Dr. Stafford, welcome to our home. And so I practice and I practice and I practice. And there's a knock on the door. And I run to the door and I throw the door open and I look up and I say, you're black. And he says, just about as black as you are pink, sugar. And he flicks my nose. And what I had realized at that moment, but much later in my life, was that I had imbibed a standard story. I had imbibed a standard story about who was a doctor, who my father's colleague would be, and even frankly, who a man would be that would be coming to our house. And it was not a black man, right? I breathed in air and drank in water that told me things that I was unconscious of, and yet I blurted out as a 4-year-old. So the first step in doing this work is to undo all of that, right? You have to undo it. Everyone should be working to improve themselves and to undo the things that we have inherited. It's not your fault that you've inherited it. It is the water that you breathe. It's in the air that you drink. It's in the 4-year-old mind that answers the door and sees someone who they didn't expect. Where do you struggle? Why do you struggle? What are your limitations? The goal is to be better. It's not to be perfect. And when you hold yourself up, I would never say that I'm an expert. I hold myself up to be a practitioner, not an exemplar. That's really important because frankly, I'm not sure that there's a way to do this perfectly, but there's a way to practice it. As you start doing that work, you've got to expand. You've got to expand things that are beyond your norm. You've got to expose yourself to things that are beyond what you're comfortable with. You listen, you read, you reflect, you read people that you wouldn't have expected, you follow things on Twitter that you don't, people that you're not a part of, you learn about communities that you're not a part of, and you don't respond. You just absorb, right? That's what you need to do. The goal is to learn a community from the inside out, not the outside in. And when you do, you'll start to understand how people view themselves, how they view their world, their values, their concerns. I work a lot in the Black church. I know that when we sing happy birthday, it's not the white version of happy birthday, right? Like you learn the patterns. And so you learn the patterns of how another community operates. And they're small things, but they're enormous things at the same time. And always you're going to be a guest in someone else's home. You're an invitee at someone else's dinner party. So act accordingly. It's okay. But the more that you understand a group, the way that they understand themselves, the more that actually they will make sense. The more you'll go beyond singular examples and stereotypes. So the goal of this phase of work is to be able to articulate the contours of a group to which you do not belong with as much sophistication and nuance as you do to the groups to which you do belong, right? When you can do that, you've actually really achieved a cognitive shift. Next, I would say you build relationships that foster accountability, that are reciprocal, that are mutual, and that foster respect. And you keep investing in them. If you don't know what pains somebody and you don't know what delights them, then you don't know them, you just sit next to them. There's a big difference. If somebody is willing to teach you, treasure their teaching, right? Teaching someone is a sacred act, and if someone is willing to teach you, listen. And then finally, act, right? This is not a theoretical conversation. This is a real life issue. This is, for some people, life and death and thriving. So act. I work in the world of religion. And you can do two different types of sermons, right? You can preach a sermon or you can live a sermon. So live a sermon with your life. Develop the practice for yourself. There are lots of ways to do ally work, but the most important is to actually do it, right? Do something. Frankly, you can see it as a burden or you can see it as a gift. I think it's a gift to be able to make the world better for somebody else to thrive, right? I actually think that, like, what greater gift is there with your life than to help set the conditions for someone else's thriving? So be grateful for the opportunity to help make the world better, even if no one sees you and if no one celebrates you for it. And then in all of this, all the undoing, expanding, building, and acting, be graceful, right? Give yourself grace, give other people grace. Life is not Twitter. People are more complex and they're more rich than the caricatures that we want to paint them as, or that what we are sort of force or mold people into being. We cannot bludgeon people into compliance. We can never bludgeon people into transformation. And what we need is transformation. That's it.
Wonderful, Brie, thank you so much. What I loved, something you said that I loved, the goal is to be better, not to be perfect. I think that is the perfect note to actually end on. This discussion could easily go on for another hour, and that highlights to me the need to follow up, not only by publishing all your recommendations and suggestions in a forthcoming column with the ABA Journal, but by having additional webinars that allows us to actually expand on some of these ideas and engage in more extensive discussion. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their important insights, particularly given the critical racial, social, and political moment that we find ourselves in. It is, so important that we're having these conversations, and it's just a start. So thank you. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining and being part of the change that is underway. And if you've been a part of the summit since the start, we really appreciate your support over the course of the past 2 days. And we're thankful to all of our sister entities at the ABA. We're thankful for the platform that the ABA and the support that the German Marshall Fund has provided in making this program such a success. With all of the registrants and feedback that we've gotten, we're really, really grateful. And we're sure we're going to see you again. So have a happy holiday season. We'll be in touch.